Hello and welcome to the Taxcast from the Tax Justice Network, your monthly podcast that's all about fixing our economies so they work for all of us. I'm your host, Naomi Fowler. You can subscribe by emailing me at naomi@taxjustice.net. Give me an email, say hello, or just find us on your favourite podcast app. Give us some 5-star ratings. Coming up later, economists in the dock.
These people are advancing ideas that are not based in fact. So what we're seeing are lost opportunities.
I'll be speaking to finance journalist and writer Tom Bergin on how economics ruins the economy. Let's head straight over now to talk to John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network to discuss this month's developments. OK, John, so this month the Tax Justice Network published its 2021 results for the Corporate Tax Haven Index. So every 2 years our researchers assess and rank the countries which are the worst offenders in helping multinational corporations pay less tax than they should. The top 10 that we have this time round are the British Virgin Islands, Cayman Islands, Bermuda, all British overseas territories. Number 4, the Netherlands. Number 5, Switzerland. Number 6, Luxembourg. Number 7, Hong Kong. Number 8, Jersey, which is a British Crown dependency. Number 9, Singapore. And at number 10, it's the United Arab Emirates. Taxcast listeners can read up on the Corporate Tax Haven Index on www.corporatetaxhavenindex.com. As usual, as you'll have heard, the British overseas territories and crown dependencies feature heavily. The UK itself, on its own, is at number 13. And as with all our indexes, the Financial Secrecy Index as well, so many of the global offenders are OECD countries. What would you highlight as being some of the most important stories from these latest results?
Well, I think the most important story told by this Corporate Tax Haven Index is how the most powerful countries in the world, that is the countries represented by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, have shaped the rules for a global tax regime which totally ignores the interests of all other countries. And that the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development countries have created between them this globalised economy in which tax havens, almost all of which are either OECD member states or dependencies and former colonies of OECD member states. These tax havens play a really central part in shifting wealth away from the country. Typically it's through illicit financial flows, so this wealth is shifted away from where wealth is actually created into the hands of the owners of capital, who use tax havens to avoid paying tax.
Right, and OECD countries and their dependencies are responsible for 68% of the world's corporate tax abuse risks.
Well, yeah, if we take just the top 10 players of the Corporate Tax Haven Index, we can see 3 OECD member states, Luxembourg, Netherlands and Switzerland. We can see 4 dependent territories of the UK, which of course is another OECD member state, the British Virgin Islands, Bermuda, Cayman and Jersey, and 2 former colonies of the United Kingdom, Hong Kong and Singapore. So the OECD member states dominate the whole index. Now what this tells us is that the world of corporate tax havens is not some kind of unfortunate outcome of globalization. It is in fact a core part of the late 20th century model of globalization. So as far as I'm concerned, the big story that the Corporate Tax Haven Index tells relates to the power of the world's biggest economies to rig the rules in their own special interests and to block the rest of the world from reforming those rules in ways that would prevent powerful corporations from avoiding tax and from extracting wealth from the world's poorest countries.
So, I mean, it's obvious now, if it hasn't been obvious before, and taxcasters know we've been saying this for such a long time, the OECD is obviously not the right organisation to be deciding on global tax rules. We've long argued for the United Nations to be central in deciding global tax rules, with more countries having a say. As the famous expression goes, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And last month, in addition, the United Nations High-Level Panel on International Financial Accountability, Transparency and Integrity, FACTI, called for a UN tax convention, which would be an agreement adopted by the UN General Assembly that would create all kinds of international norms and standards which would become legally binding when UN member states ratify that convention. Let's talk a bit about that as a way forward.
Well, yeah, it is, I think, the only way forward now. It seems a no-brainer to me that if the world wants to see an end to the institutional stranglehold that the rich and powerful countries hold over the rule-making process, the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development really needs to relinquish its rule-setting role and hand over to a genuinely global and accountable body. Now, in the best of all worlds, I think we'd see the creation of a world tax authority mandated by the United Nations to set rules for taxing multinational companies and also for protecting nation states across the world from the predatory and race-to-the-bottom tactics of the OECD tax havens. But, realistically, we've got to accept the very hard political fact that the prominent OECD member states, including Britain and the United States, both of which are major tax havens and protectors of tax havens, these states can exert powerful blocking measures within the United Nations political processes. So this might be a project that is best handled step by step. And a first step would be to elevate the existing United Nations Committee of Experts on International Tax Matters, which has no political status, by the way, to an intergovernmental body with political status. And this can be accompanied by a UN tax convention along the lines suggested by that high-level FACTI panel you've mentioned. Now, I know from my own experience of working with the civil society group called the Friends of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and I've been involved with that group for over 15 years now, these conventions can take a really long time to draft and steer through the United Nations processes. And sometimes the initial conventions are weak, but they will require strengthening. But I think we just have to accept that's the case. What's needed more than anything else is to have a global counterweight to the rules set by the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now, whilst the OECD rules don't have legal status in their own right, they are typically adopted into the tax laws of member states and states across the rest of the world, and they become a reference point which courts and tribunals will use when they're assessing the legality or otherwise of a tax avoidance scheme. So a UN tax convention could become a really powerful mechanism and a reference point for the whole process of reshaping tax rules to make them fit for the 21st century and for the needs of all countries, not just OECD member states.
Yeah, and perhaps with the new administration, the Biden administration, there may be more support for some meaningful activity on tax rules, global tax rules, and perhaps even more support for a UN involvement in that. And they've just announced a 21% minimum corporate tax rate proposal, so that's interesting.
And alongside that, of course, the US, I'm very excited about this. If I'm honest, they're also talking about completely rebooting the Internal Revenue Service, massively refunding it to make it an effective body. So that in itself is exciting. But Joe Biden has spoken very publicly and for a long time about the United States re-engaging internationally, and there's no better place for him to demonstrate that kind of leadership role and engagement with the rest of the world than in the area of taxation and getting this one sorted. It has caused so many problems across the world now. It would be really good to see a Biden administration take a leadership role in this area.
Yes, it would. And speaking of the power of blocs and nations, let's look at the European Union. There is some movement there to do something about the EU's laughable list of non-cooperative jurisdictions. Their list, as we've said many times on the Taxcast, all the more ridiculous because EU member states themselves aren't included on that list, when many of them are, major offenders. And then you get sort of crazinesses like the removal of the Cayman Islands from the EU list, which is crazy. We know it absolutely belongs right up there along with a lot of other jurisdictions responsible for stripping other nations of tax revenue. So the EU...
Yeah, well, long sigh. This isn't the first time, and it certainly won't be the last time that you and I reflect on the absurdity of this European Union listing of so-called non-cooperative jurisdictions. Of course, we call non-cooperative jurisdictions tax havens, but they don't like that term. Now, the European Union list published in February 2021 includes 12 jurisdictions, almost all small islands, most of them located in the Caribbean, the Pacific or the Indian Ocean. This list, which is prepared by the Code of Conduct Group on Business Taxation, and they do this work on behalf of the European Council, that begs an interesting question. Why isn't the United States of America listed? It has a massive offshore financial services sector. The US is ranked at number 25 on the Tax Justice Network Corporate Tax Haven Index, and the US still hasn't signed up to the Global Common Reporting Standard for Tax Information Exchange, and yet somehow it avoids being listed by the European Union. So I think we can all recognise that the EU's listing process is ridiculous. If we look at the 12 jurisdictions listed in February 2021, it includes places like Samoa, Fiji, Dominica and Guam. Now, these 12 jurisdictions between them are responsible for less than 2% of the global corporate tax abuse risk. And what makes the European Union listing all the more outrageous is if you tally up the global corporate tax abuse risks arising just from European Union member states, that is Ireland, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, and so on, you can see they are responsible between them for 38% of that global risk identified by the Tax Justice Network Corporate Tax Haven Index. Politically, I think this is very damaging to the European Union, and it sends a really strong signal to the rest of the world that the European Union is quite prepared to turn a blind eye to corrupt financial practices and to the ways in which powerful corporations harm local economies and harm democracy.
Yes, indeed. And just to add, the United States is number 2 in the Financial Secrecy Index. So, yeah, they've got a lot of work to do. And, the European Union need look no further, really. If you ask me, we've got already the Financial Secrecy Index and the Corporate Tax Haven Index, which thoroughly and non-politically looks at the evidence and assesses countries. I mean, the work is all there for them to use if they are serious.
Well, let's hope the European Union picks up the phone to the Tax Justice Network and asks us if they can formally adopt the Corporate Tax Haven Index and the Financial Secrecy Index as a key part, if not the key part, of their listing process. The phone lines are open now.
Thanks, John. John Christensen of the Tax Justice Network. Now it's time for the Taxcast special feature. Much of the world is run on the basis of economic theories that have become accepted truths of our era, but they actually have very little evidence to back them up. In fact, they're better described as faith-based beliefs. This month, I'm talking to finance journalist and author Tom Bergin about his book, Free Lunch Thinking: How Economics Ruins the Economy. In his book, he investigates the evidence for a series of economic theories, things like the notorious Laffer curve. So, do lower taxes really aid growth? He looks at things like the hire and fire debate. Does job security make us lazy? Does a minimum wage really lead to lost jobs? Are taxes on business damaging? Does regulation harm business? Things like that. And this book is great for anyone who wants to fully get why some of these beliefs are nonsense. Yet they endure. They're still central to policy making around the world. We need to break these blind faith-based beliefs and change the narrative. So it was great to talk to Tom, who's put these theories in the doc. And it's not just theories he puts in the doc. Here's Tom Bergen.
One of the jobs of an investigative reporter is to be shouted at and threatened by rich and powerful people. The particular one involving Donald Trump was whereby I was doing a story about him when he was running, he was a candidate for the presidency. And one of the main kind of selling points that he was offering the American public was that I could fix America's finances and improve the economy because I'm a great businessman. I've done this in my own business. And I started to look at the area where he had invested most of his money really over the previous 20 years, which was in the golf space. And I calculated, based on his own statements, he'd invested over $1 billion in golf assets and associated assets, which were worth about half that. So when I presented that evidence to him, he wasn't very happy. We spent about 20 minutes, half an hour on the phone in rather robust discussion. But at the we also got around to talking about the economy and broader issues, during which he shared with me his faith in supply side economics and his general thinking that he could raise revenues and he could improve the balance by cutting later he became clear was the magic ingredients was tax cuts, which is essentially Lafferism, Laffer curve that Donald Trump was campaigning on, is something that I tackle in quite detail in the book.
Yeah, and it's such a good place to start with somebody like Donald Trump, because there's so much kind of buzz around him as a person, and it's all about sort of presentation rather than substance, right? So in that same way, your book's all about economic theories which have little to no basis in any evidence, but it doesn't stop people like Donald Trump using that to prop up how he might like the world to work, or at least how he might like us to believe that the world works. So, I mean, in the UK, not wanting to focus too much on the UK, but we just had the most saddening budget we've had for a quite long time, which seems to be based blatantly on a belief in trickle-down economics. And I just wonder what you think about whether politicians actually know that these economic theories are bullshit, or whether they actually do believe in them. And I mean, I'm not really sure which is worse, actually, ignorance or cynical deployment of myths that are politically useful for them and keep their donors happy. I mean, what do you think?
It's an interesting question. I think that, if you look at Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, who really pillars of the Republican establishment for much of the past half century, really. They talked about seeing the Laffer curve for the first time and that being a major moment in their education and economics. I remember David Gauke, the former tax minister in the UK, asking him about why he was cutting corporate taxes so robustly. And he said, this was informed by the economic theory presented by the OECD and others, which showed that essentially the corporation tax was a bad tax and stunted growth. So there's definitely, I think, an influence there, a reliance on theory. It's true, obviously, some of these people can also be attracted to what's intuitive to them. I mean, in the case of Cheney, we certainly saw that as vice president. When it came to intelligence matters, he tended to have a bit of a leaning towards information that he liked the sound of. But I think also we can see where the theory's influence is also evidence when we see people change their minds.
Yeah, and you talk about one such person who seemed really unlikely person to change his mind after having spent a career advancing really damaging faith-based economic theories. You talk in the book about the former member of the Chicago School of Economics, Paul Romer, who you met, who did change his mind. And he said the Chicago School was basically a libertarian anti-government project, not a scientific endeavour.
Absolutely. That was a really interesting meeting. I've spoken to Paul Romer a few times, and his journey is a really interesting one, and he has made himself something of a pariah among the economic establishment in the United States by calling out by name specific, very senior economists, Nobel Prize winners, and saying that basically they're dishonest. I mean, he said that these people are advancing ideas that are not based in fact, it's totally ideology. And when they produce evidence using fancy maths to defend it, usually that maths is there intended to hide things rather than to reveal a complex truth. And, I think the fact that people do sometimes change their mind is massively interesting. Unfortunately, it's quite rare. And, one of the points that I discussed with Paul Rummer was the way that there's, unfortunately, within the economics community, there's a perverse incentive there that economists, it's in their interest to advance the view of the world as being a mechanism determined by price relationships. Because if we all accept that's how the world works, then the people we need to go to provide the answers to the problems of the world are economists. This is just a wonderful position to be in for any profession, to be the people who, the wise people of the world or the world leaders say, these are the people with the answers. So unfortunately, I think that economists are faced with that incentive to advance ideas which are not correct, but which afford them influence. Hopefully, economists can learn to be humble, to accept perhaps a less influential role. If they do, I think they might make a much more valuable contribution to the world.
Right, and you called your book Free Lunch Thinking, How Economics Ruins the Economy. It's a great title. Why did you call it that?
I'm glad you like it. The main title is a play on an old saying that was popularized by conservative economist Milton Friedman. He would say there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I think that was really intended as a sort of right-wing retort to liberals who argued that there should be regulation on companies and taxation on the affluent to improve society. Now, I'm one of those who thinks that Milton Friedman was an ideologue, more that than a social scientist. If you really follow the logic of people like Friedman to its conclusion, what you find is that people who say, there's no such thing as a free lunch in a very realpolitik kind of world or, hard fact truth position, to say actually they become the ones who are arguing for a free lunch. And so specifically, we'll see situations where people end up arguing, if you cut taxes, you can raise revenue. I mean, there's a free lunch. Isn't that wonderful? Or you can remove social protections like worker safety rules without making people less safe. And also, in the meantime, make everyone richer. Here we go, free lunch.
And how about the second part of the title, How Economics Ruins the Economy?
With respect to how economics ruins the economy, I think that economic theory that markets determine the world is a belief which has caused a lot of damage, and not just social damage in terms of inequality, but also made us poorer. What we see is that some ideas like, trying to raise tax revenue by cutting taxes actually can be damaging to the economy. So what I say in the book is I look through a number of policies which have been advanced and defended as a way to grow the economy, make it grow more quickly, and show that it hasn't. So what we're seeing are lost opportunities. So it's damaging the economy. In terms of specific people, of course, the damage can be much worse. If you look at something like the minimum wage, economists argued for decades that the minimum wage is a bad idea and that it would cost jobs among the least well off. They argue worse that there was lots of evidence to prove that. There was no evidence to prove that, and it hasn't been the case. It's been tested again and again in different countries. This means that people were denied wage increases that the economy could have very effectively paid them, and their life has been significantly disadvantaged. There are lots of other cases for this. So I think that it has caused a lot of damage that economists should answer for.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so important to make this point, but it actually harms the economy as well. It's not just people. And, this double standard in terms of the very wealthy and corporations perfectly happy to take all sorts of state subsidies, but not being okay about, the minimum wage or expecting the state to cover food stamps and things like this when people can't afford to buy enough food for their families. The double standard thing is just so fascinating. I wanted to ask you about, have the field of economics is so dominated by men historically, that's very slowly changing. You've been a finance journalist for a long time. You've seen how the mainstream media commentators on business and finance are also very male dominated. And I don't want to push this too far, but, to what extent do you think popular ideas about business that are propagated in the mainstream media are kind of testosterone fueled?
I think the depiction of the business world that you describe, I think it's true that it is described in testosterone fueled ways. It's described the business world as a battle, it's competing forces. And this, lends itself to the reporting of heroic figures who are being successful. And I think, there is a strong case, particularly in the retail end of the media, where people are trying to sell business news stories to a broader audience, that there might be a case that can help, enliven it. But I think it is something that's very much informed by economic theory. And if you look at the general economic view of the world, which is that it's a series of markets where you have buyers and sellers constantly vying against one another. As you say, that's quite a testosterone-fueled kind of environment and way to perceive the world. That there's an ongoing battle for control and power between different sides, and that process leads to value creation in itself, that people are forced to strive to compete in a more competitive way. Is that influenced by men? The fact that economics has always been a male-driven thing? I mean, I guess we should be surprised if it's not. That's the way that boys are taught to see the world, as competing on the playing fields or whatever. I don't think that it's a particularly accurate view or informative view of the wealth generation process. I think it totally overlooks the benefits and the gains from collaboration and cooperation. Because big businesses who are interested in value creation know the way to make more money is to get their workers to cooperate together in a more effective way. So I think that's something that's not depicted well within the theoretical framework of economics, which then informs the way we perceive business. So yes, I think that the kind of cliched, easy, lazy view of the way that business and the economy works is inaccurate, and I hope there is enough evidence coming through at the moment to show that that sort of rather old style view is not one that we can really make decisions based on.
I wanted to ask you about those who are most responsible for some of these economic myths and how they actually live their lives. I always find this so fascinating. It tells you everything about the nature of their connections of the rest of the world and to people in the country they live in, and you describe in the book going to Arthur Laffer's house, Arthur Laffer being the main architect of the Laffer curve, the theory that cutting taxes will lead to growth. And so when you visited him, you talk about how he chose a particular state to live in the US because of the tax benefits there. And he says from the savings he got from these tax benefits, he bought his entire house. And, it sounds like a lot like a used car salesman. But, I mean, what impressions did you have of this man whose work has really shaped bad economic decisions for decades that have been hurting so many people?
It's interesting. Arthur Laffer, at a personal level, is very gregarious, and I think that's probably one of the things that has helped him be influential. He's someone who's advised Democrats as well as Republicans. He, when you visit his house, he has pictures of him with, the Kennedys and all kinds of people from, both sides of the aisle. And one of the points I make in the book is that he's very good at marketing, and those personal skills actually, the ability, quick with an anecdote and a joke and able to paint a picture quite nicely. That's really one of the things that has helped advance supply side economics in the Laffer curve, something that really doesn't have any data, but there's lots of good stories there to back it up. And so there's quite strong, I would say, personal skills. I'm a journalist, I'm not a priest, so it's not my job to say if someone being a tax exile is morally repugnant. I think people can make their own decision on it. I would say that mathematically speaking, there is a consequence to that. That everybody can't decide to work in one country and pay their taxes on the moon. Where tax rates are zero. No idea of social responsibility.
Yeah, it's a sad way to live, actually, to have this disconnect from the rest of society.
Can be quite a sort of contentious view of their fellow man, particularly their fellow man who is not being as financially successful as they are, and natural human tendency to believe that everything good that comes into their life is their own just desserts.
And we know that some of the super rich, are not necessarily living happy lives. and Laffer is still so important. He was an advisor to Trump before and during his presidency, who then went on and made the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act the centre of his economic policy. He gave Laffer the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the US's highest civilian honour. I mean, it's incredible how far a good story and the gift of a gab will get somebody.
Absolutely. It's all in the way you tell them. The supply side economics kind of really leveraged off a few stories that just really captured people's imagination. The value of good stories, they really can have an outsized impact on how people accept ideas. Hopefully, I think when you show people that the ideas that they have aren't supported in the way that they think they are, that evidence is not there. Just to call out and say the emperor has no clothes, I hope is a valuable activity.
Valuable indeed. Thanks, Tom. Tom Bergin's book, Free Lunch Thinking, How Economics Ruins the Economy, is published by Penguin. You can get the details in the show notes. That's it for now. Thanks for listening. We'll be back with you next month.